death is the actual most terrifying thing to the living system. And so we do avoid it, intellectually, because we don't want to be close to it. In my work, what I'm really trying to do is, one, normalize that like everybody's going to grieve. I mean, literally everyone's going to grieve. No one escapes it.
Hey, I'm Tanya Wilkinson, and this is Death on the Daily, bringing the conversation about death out of the shadows and into the mainstream. Because along with birth and change, if there's one thing that's going to happen to us all, then death is it. And we're going to explore how death actually shows up for us on the daily in a multitude of ways, and how when we allow ourselves to accept and to be with death, how it can teach us a whole heap about how to live this life well. Here's some things I asked myself when I was in the rawest of my grief. Why does it feel like I'm on another planet? This was basically on repeat any time I stepped out of the cocoon that is my house. Why can't I remember anything? Because unless it was written on a list under my nose, forget about it happening. And why do I feel so isolated from many who I love? That one, that really hurt. And so many of these griefy whys are left unanswered, leaving us floating in another orbit that is far, far away from planet Earth. Because even though, as my guest today says, it is inevitable that we will all experience grief in life, yet it is still so unspoken and unsupported in our systems. So let's get you some answers. I'm joined today by Megan Riordan Jarvis, a trauma-trained clinical psychotherapist, author, podcast host, 2 times TEDx speaker and consultant. And what I love about Megan is how she breaks down grief into simple answers to get to all of those why questions, as well as encouraging us to create our own grief practice. So whether you're grieving or supporting someone who is, I hope our conversation will help you to understand what grief is, how we experience it, and the support that is out there for you. So Megan, welcome to Death on the Daily.
I am really, really honored to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited for this conversation. It's one that so many of us avoid. And we're going to be speaking about grief and loss. And in our society, grief really isn't spoken to enough. That's definitely been in my experience. It's something that really came through as I've been reading your books. So let's start the conversation with what grief is. Like, how do we know when we're experiencing grief?
Yeah. People have all kinds of definitions. I'll give you mine, which took me a little while to land on, but I like a lot. And it's really more from my clinical work. I define grief as the energy that's created inside your body on account of loss. So when we're talking about, death and dying and getting divorced or breaking up or a health issue, all the things that can generate energy, I think part of what we're thinking about is what we have lost. Like, oh, my dad died, he's gone. What I really want people to focus on is and in the wake of that, there is a new energy inside your system that wasn't there before. And it can feel maybe like anxiety, or maybe it'll feel like depression, or maybe it'll feel like numbness or nothing. But it is a new energy, I think, for most people.
I love that perspective of the new energy, because grief is so unique, isn't it, to each of us? So it's not like there's a checklist of, oh yeah, you've got all these symptoms, therefore it is grief. And there is some, actually, what really came through as I was reading your brilliant book, Can Anyone Tell Me, that are not commonly known, that we wouldn't really understand or be able to say that is grief. And what that can, I mean, in my experience, what it's led me to is feeling like I've literally stepped out of my body and actually stepped off of this planet Earth into a whole different experience.
Totally.
So what could you share around those, I suppose, lesser known symptoms of grief?
Well, I love what you just said, which is that it's so specific to individuals that people often don't know that it's grief. And I think that is the nail on the head in terms of part of why the conversation is so hard. I've had multiple people say to me, and I really took it to heart when they did, you can't really teach grief. It doesn't make sense to talk about grief because everybody's responses to loss is different. Which is completely true. Everybody's responses to loss is different because, the same way that what you wake up hungry for in the morning is different than what I wake up hungry for in the morning. But if you focus on the body as the mechanism with which we do our grieving, the body and the mind, then we can look at things that are more generalizable, because everybody lives their human life in their human body. And then we can look at it more like you would maybe, a health class, or talking about pregnancy, or talking about aging or dementia, just sort of, when we're talking to a teenager about what their body might go through in puberty, it's a really broad spectrum of things. Like, some little boys have voices that drop octaves overnight, but others don't. One of my kids had literal growing pains, like his bones were growing so fast, but not everybody has that. But it's really important to let everybody know that that's all part of puberty, so that the families who are experiencing that aren't running to the doctors or feeling terrified or feeling like, aberrations on account of it. So grief for me is a lot like that. I've spent 22 years working with clients, listening to their stories. I didn't always identify specifically as someone who was a grief specialist, although loss is primarily at the root of most conversations that I'm having as a therapist, and attending to the energy that is the grief that needs to move through people's systems really is what we are focused on. So in the book, I try to really let people know things that are common. And there's a lot of crossover. Like, there's a lot of crossover between when people get depressed or when people are anxious. And then there are things that really are kind of like hallmarks of grievers that are such a relief when you say, oh, no, I often joke. I just had this conversation with someone, a client yesterday. She was waiting for some medical news on her son. And I said, oh, well, so obviously you're dress rehearsing him like dying, and what you're going to wear and what you're going to put in the casket with him. And she sort of burst out laughing, and she was like, yeah, obviously. And then she said, does anybody not do that? And I was like, I think it's human, but I think it is very, very human for grievers. People who have lived through profound loss, things that they never thought that they could bear again. We do kind of touch that third rail.
Mhm.
Often, if you're 10 minutes late, I might decide you crashed your car, and like my mind is kind of imagining it in this morbid way, but it's not really morbid. It's just grief is all around us. Loss is all around us. Death is part of our lives. And there's not a lot of oxygen or way to talk about it. So I think if we strip back this idea that like it's too personal to talk about, we talk about the most personal things, at least over here in the States, right? Like, people are telling you about their sex lives, and they're talking to you about what they're eating. And, I don't think it's that it's too personal. I think it's that it makes us feel kind of helpless because we don't know what to do with it. And so what I really try to do in the book is say, hey, it's really common for you to lose your appetite. It's really common for you to have ruminations. So ruminations is a thing I've spent some time on, because my belief is ruminations are one of the things that can kind of make us a little bit sick if we don't work hard to encourage ourselves to like manage them. If we let them run rampant, they can really, I think, do some damage in our thinking. And then if our thinking gets too distorted, that can impact our feeling, inside our body. So there are a bunch of things that people experience as grief symptoms that, I don't know, like maybe they didn't realize were grief symptoms. So sleeplessness is one of them. I tell this story a lot, but I had a CEO of a huge organization here in the DC area come in. He was so mad that he was coming in. And I was like, what's the problem? He said, I can't sleep, and my doctor won't give me more medicine. He says I have to come see a therapist. He thinks it's all in my mind. I said, how long? I mean, I'd only talked to him for 10 minutes. How long have you not been sleeping? Well, about a year, maybe 18 months. Well, what happened 18 months ago? Well, I mean, my dad died, but I don't think that has anything to do with it. And I just felt like you shouldn't have to think it has anything to do with it. You should just know that disrupted sleep, first of all, it's not a weakness. It's like a total common experience. We're talking about our subconscious, so it's not like I'm intentionally having these thoughts. But we just sort of unwound it from there. And like, I didn't even really need to see him that often, because once he was able to acknowledge, like, oh no, my dad's death did have an impact on my system, he was able then to do some things, to try some interventions, to try some things to encourage his body back into a state of rest. That honestly, I don't see CEOs as very restful people in general. So being able to sort of say like, no, this is a different kind.
Mhm.
This is a grief related one. Yeah. So being able to put those kind of qualities in the book, migraines, muscle tension, we have 12 physical systems in our body. Things like our respiratory tract and our respiratory system and our muscles and our skin and our nails and our hair and our endocrine system and our reproductive tract. All of those things can be impacted by the grieving process.
Mhm.
So, sometimes people will say like, oh, we were trying to get pregnant after my mom died and it took 5 or 6 years because of stress. And I always try to sort of tweak that, which is like stress is sort of all encompassing and makes it sound like, I don't know, you don't have a job that respects you or that your house is chaotic. When we tweak it and say, I was grieving
Mm.
and the grief was impacting my fertility, it just takes on a totally different, it's almost, I can always feel it in my body. Like, it's like, oh, that happened to you. It's not something you're failing at. It's something that happened to you. And I just think the shift in energy is really critically important.
Yeah, I know that to be true. Actually, there's so much stuff that you shared that resonated with me in my grief journey after we lost our daughter, and my cycles went wacky
Yeah.
for the best part of a year.
Yeah.
And it was when I sunk into that acceptance, and that was with my therapist of actually, I'm going through a lot. It's okay. There was an acceptance that came. There was obviously the work that was happening to support me through all of that. But being able to understand that really, really helped me to just take a breath and not add extra pressure on myself. And then similarly, it's where grief pops up at random points. I remember I had my wisdom tooth out last year, and it really triggered my grief. And I was sat in the dentist chair and just feeling, because I feel empowered obviously through everything that I'm doing. Death in the Daily didn't exist then, but this was definitely in the throes, and through my end of life doula training, I felt empowered to be able to speak to it. So I just voiced it. And I said, I don't know why, but my grief is coming. I feel it. And that in itself just helped me to diffuse that what was going on,
So
and to be able to just sit and have a chat with the lovely nurse who was there. We had a chat, had a little a cup of water, plastic
yeah.
cup of water. But
They don't let you drink much at the dentist. Yeah.
exactly. Probably needed something a bit stiffer. But those moments of being able to acknowledge it and to speak it out made all of the difference in
I
all of those.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's
I
all.
love so much what you just said, and I feel like it's such an important model because I have never heard a client, I have never had my own experience, I've never talked to a friend who let someone know that they were grieving and didn't get immediate support. I have
Mhm.
never, ever heard it happen. I have never heard someone say, I turned to this person in the airport and said, I just got this terrible piece of news. And that person was like, see ya. So
Mhm.
there's something in this, right? Which is like grief is a universal human experience. Culturally, we have such trouble with it. And there's probably lots of reasons why. And one of it might be as basic as, death is the actual most terrifying thing to the living system. And so we do avoid it, intellectually because we don't want to be close to it. In my work, what I'm really trying to do is one, normalize that like everybody's going to grieve. I mean, literally everyone's going to grieve. No one escapes it. No one escapes it. There's some of us that did it earlier than others, but everyone does it over time. Every one of those people that's going through grief describes it the way you did, which is like, I'm not even on this planet anymore. I'm like in a spacesuit. Like there's no gravity anymore. The axis of the earth is no longer correct. Everyone describes it the same way. And then they say like, I have a moment where I can look back and see my life before, and then it cracks open, and then there's an after. And most of us have no idea how to live in the after because whatever it is that we lost was so profound and such an identifier and the thing that tethered us to the life that we wanted that we literally don't know how to live without it. And so then we're inventing ourselves in this present moment. Again, a little bit like teenagers who are, they come down and they're wearing like, I don't know, like a little floral dress one day, and then they're dressed like a rapper the next day. They're like trying to discover their identity. We don't say to them like, man, you're really failing because you're all over the place. We say like, yeah, it's really hard to find your way forward. And at some point it settles and you integrate and you're like, no, I'm more like a rapper than I am, a princess. And you sort of, but you're always changing and you're always growing into it and you're always experiencing new parts of yourself. But that is what I think becoming a griever really is like change that is thrust upon you that you very quickly have to adjust to with the eyes of everyone who cares about you and the rest of the culture watching. So
Mm.
we feel super self-conscious, we feel super awkward, we feel very unable, we often feel deeply criticized because let's make no mistake, we are being deeply criticized by people who think they know better than what we do, what we're doing. And so what that means is our relationships then sort of change because like our friend who used to be really supportive now is judgmental, and our boss who we thought we liked now seems to be unreasonable, and so there's this, it's just kind of relentless for a while. The shift
Mhm.
and the change is really kind of relentless. But I really feel like if you are willing to say, I'm struggling out loud, there are people out there who will be like, yeah, me too. Or,
Mm.
yeah, I was where you were. I get it. It is that hard. You're not crazy. And so I really encourage my grievers to, like, very early on, come up with a small clutch of people, 3 to 5 people who are their trusted troop, who they can, in moments like the dentist, immediately reach out to and say, something, I'm in my grief right now and it's bad.
Mm.
You don't even have to say I'm at the dentist. I'm like, these people know. Because that loneliness and that sense of isolation that really can define how we move through the world, where we feel like we're other than and we're not part of society, we can kind of break through that as long as we have a couple of people who we can reach out to in that moment and say, I don't want to be alone in this. I don't want to be by myself. And I talk about it. And can anyone tell me? I say to identify 3 people. I always talk about my trusted trio, because they're very different people. And when I text them, they respond with very different things. And that is really helpful. I mean, you have to have 3 or 5 because you can't just have one. Because what if they're in a meeting for the next 5 hours? Like, you need a little network. And also because they're human. And so one of them might say the wrong thing, right? One of them might show up really sincerely. I always tell that story. Like, one of my people is always like, are you okay? Should you be driving? Like, take a deep breath. And I'm like, I'm fine. I'm just like mad because mostly my grief feels like anger. And then I have another friend who's never available. She'll call me like a day later because she's very busy and very important. And then I have someone who's very funny and will always be like, tell those people to F off, like, or just, pull the fire alarm or throw a drink on them. And I never, of course, do any of those things, but that's the kind of support that often is what I need.
Oh, I love that trusted trio. I can really, really relate to that. Actually, I'm thinking I definitely had a trusted trio who, yeah, did very different things. I had one that I made sure she's just up the road from me, so she's a short walk away. If I needed to say, let's go stomp around the park, yeah, I need to go kick some piles of dirt in the forest. Let's go do it. It's so important, and I think that's so powerful, particularly for when we feel lonely, and equally for anyone who is witnessing someone grieving. I think that's where we can. I had a friend, Christiana, who reached out immediately and said, she was the one who basically told me, you will get through this. You will. And actually, it was on her lived experience because she had done that. She'd walked that path before me.
Such a gift when people can say that to you.
Yeah, it's
I mean,
so
you also
powerful.
kind of hate them because you're like, no, I can't. But you can kind of like borrow on the hope because you know that they thought they couldn't either, and now they somehow have.
Yeah.
And I just think it's important to say, because I talk a lot about relationships and how they can really fall apart or shift and change.
Mhm.
Some for the better, right? Some people can show up in ways that you never expected them to
Mhm.
show up and say the exact right thing or do the exact right thing. And not always because they've been through loss themselves, just sometimes because that, they're good at this part of life.
Yeah.
But I do think it's really important for people to know that you don't have to have, I don't know if you have this, but on my Instagram account, I have like a couple of friends who, I don't know, it looks like once or twice a year they go away with like 13 girlfriends. They're all like wearing matching sweaters and they're in Nashville.
Mhm.
I don't have friends like that. Like, that's not how I live my life. I have a couple of clutch people who've been there a long time. I also have clients who would tell you they don't have any friends for many, many reasons, that there are not people that they feel like they're close to or could be close to. Maybe they're recently divorced. Maybe it's been a hard thing their whole life. It still doesn't matter. You can still come up with a trusted trio of people because people like to be asked to help. So I had a client that moved to New York during COVID, ostensibly to be closer to her mother and father, and they both died within like weeks of each other from COVID. And so she was literally completely alone and stuck. Like she couldn't even go back to where she had come from. And it was, I mean, really some of the most hopeless and helpless energy I have ever felt in a person. And God love her, because I was like, you need people who can help you when you get really overwhelmed, which was happening really often, right? She had the guy who walked her dog, her doorman, and her dry cleaner. Those were the three people. I said,
Wow.
like, just ask them if you know their names, just ask them. And all three, it was all three men. She was a young woman. And they so kindly said yes. And they
Wow.
became real friends to her.
Oh,
Real friends to her that like didn't know much about her life, didn't, the dog walker knew where she lived, but nobody else did. And so I'm just saying, I know some people listen to this and they're feeling really isolated, because isolation is such a part of grief, and isolation is different than loneliness. Loneliness has this longing to be connected to people. Isolation feels like you're in a glass jar
mhm.
and you can't get out. It feels like the world is out there and you are not a part of it. And isolation can be really dangerous. I mean, loneliness can be dangerous too, but loneliness, we have a little bit more energy and capacity to kind of reach out. Isolation, people
Mhm.
can really feel like there's no possibilities. And so I'm just saying that for those folks who are like, but Megan, I don't have a lot of friends. I'm not asking about friends. I'm not saying this has to be friends. I'm just saying this, it could be your rabbi. It could be your SAT tutor. It just has to be someone who says, yes, I'm willing for you to reach out to me. I am on people's trusted trio. Um, I am probably 10 people's text message. And I'll be honest,
Mhm.
I don't get texted that often.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
I am also really grateful, because I think people like to be asked to help. I don't think they like to be asked to help to do things that they don't want to do, and I don't think they like to be asked to help when actually the person is helpless and there is no help to offer. Right? That just makes us all feel anxious. Like if I come to you and I say like, "Oh God, I'm really overwhelmed and I don't feel like I'm ever going to date again and I feel really lonely." And your response is, "Well, what if we put you on, like a dating app, and what if," and I am resistant to that because I don't really want help, which is fine, by the way. I don't need to want help. But if there's a mismatch, it can make the people who are trying to support us really feel terrible, and like, God, I don't want to be around Megan. She's really like a bummer. So the more clarity you can get about what it is that you need in this moment, right? Like most of the time, my trusted trio, one lives in Seattle and two live in Boston. So I'm in DC. They're not coming to help me. They're not going to pull up alongside me and do and do anything helpful. But I think it's just important to know that that isolation and loneliness is a standard experience. And when people say they don't have it, I almost don't trust them. And it's a standard experience of profound loss, and it is something that we can push a little bit on, that kind of requires us to do a little bit with.
Mm. What I could really feel there is that openness. Stay open to those connections. Who's in your orbit? Who you can, because it is the surprising ones. I have one of my trio was my dear friend now, very dear friend. I'd been going to her for pregnancy massages and been seeing her a bit before pregnancy as well. But that was just in the treatment space. And she was the one who, I just sort of messaged her, gave her a little update, and she was straight there, dropped a little gift on the doorstep, and that was that. And then we started texting and chatting, and then it was a walk, and then she was coming with me to our daughter's, where she's buried in a beautiful woodland burial spot, and it's created the most beautiful friendship that is just truly wonderful. So I think what I can really feel from that is do stay open, because
Yeah.
if you are thinking, for me it was everyone disappeared, because I think baby loss is a really difficult
Oh,
one
it's so
to hold.
scary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really, really complicated, and you can't, there's nothing you could, I think for a lot of people, it's probably that worst nightmare,
Yeah.
losing your child. And it was that sort of disappearance. But to your point, there were people who were
Yeah.
there, who were in my
Well, and
presence.
you're describing something really beautiful that grew out of that. And again, for people that are in like the early days of grief, don't listen to me because you're going to be like, screw you. But beautiful things do grow out of the
Hmm.
deepest places of our pain. And it's, it could be you start a podcast, it could be you write a book, but it could just be that you start a friendship, that you
Hmm.
like more intimately and deeply connect to people. I had a lot of friendship loss as part of my experience after my mom died. I just was angry all the time. I just was not an easy person to be around. So I had a lot of friendship loss, but I also started a lot of friendships. And I was out in LA because we've had these terrible fires here, and I was doing some trauma work out there. And a friend, I don't know him that well. But we went and he came and rescued me because the work I was doing was really hard. So he came so that we could have some coffee. And we got in line and we just like dove into, there was no like small talk, like, how are you? Are you going to the gym? It was like, we just dove into real conversation. And this person behind us kind of looked at us and I was like, I know you're kind of jealous. Like it's an amazing, but so, even though there's been a lot of loss on top of loss, also there have been some big shifts in my way of being. I just don't have a lot of superficiality. I
Hmm.
mean, partly because I don't have the patience for it anymore. It's like it broke. But what that means is the people that I keep close really feel like diamonds. Um, and that's amazing. And I think I would have actively said, like, oh, I like them. I'm not sure that they're, I would want to go on a road trip with them. Like, I don't really have those connections, those looser connections anymore.
Mm. Wow. Those diamonds that came through. And I love that because there's obviously a lot of conversation around the secondary losses, those friendships that
Yeah.
do end up being lost as a result of the primary loss. But I love that as well, that acknowledgement as well. There's
Yeah.
these diamonds that come through. There's the new or the strengthening of
Yeah.
friendships that you can
There's so
do.
much change of who you are and what you care about, right? Like I've had
Mm,
people who no longer care about their job. That happened a
mm,
lot in COVID. COVID felt like this, crazy experience for where people were really having to look at how they spent their time and decide whether it had mattered. Does
yeah.
it matter? Does it matter that I'm writing copy for, a coffee shop? Like, does it matter? Do I care about this? And I think profound loss does that, is it really asks you to look sort of like, you know, at your spiritual center and your intellectual center. And are you oriented to a true north? Like, are you? And that is one of the gifts of profound loss. It sure doesn't feel like a gift when it is happening. It feels, disorienting and terrible. But if you think about it as this period of becoming, it is pretty extraordinary to watch people become. I'm 50, I was 45 when my mom died. If you had said to me when I was 17, like, do 45-year-olds, change much? I would have been like, oh no, they have gray hair and they're old and they just like sit in rocking chairs. But so much of my life shifted and changed because my needs were different. And I think, going back to that concept of like energy, grief is the energy that's created inside the body on account of loss. If you're able to really get quiet and focus on what that energy is, it will often point out to you places where you're just almost like giving your energy away for free, places where it's not in alignment, that you just do it because it's habit or because everybody else does it. And somebody said to me, like, that profound loss is like inviting Marie Kondo in to, you know, check out your soul, to condo your soul. And it's true. I mean, it really is, right? Where because there's such limited capacity, because it's so hard to be in the world now, there's
Mhm.
like a limited capacity. You For a lot of those things that you used to do that were done almost without thought, we need that energy just to survive.
Yeah.
And then some of that doesn't come back online. And I talk about that in the book. I talk about sort of how identity can really shift. And I think we think of it all as bad and painful and it is kind of bad and painful. But things can be bad, going into labor with a baby is bad and painful. The hope is that we're going to get to the other side with something beautiful. We don't always, but we do meet our new version of ourselves on the other side. And I do, I'm 5 years out from my mom's loss. I still grieve her all the time. I still grieve her every day. I feel the loss of her in my life all the time. But I also have to look around and be like, look at all these things that are here that would never have been here if I hadn't had the experience that I did.
Mm. Yeah, I really feel that. That really resonate, and I love that that's in your book, because I think it's that those lightning bolts of clarity that can come, and actually to be able to embrace them alongside, obviously journeying with the pain, the sadness,
Yeah.
all of that. And yeah, for me, actually, my catalyst for leaving Formula One was
Yeah.
the grief of an early miscarriage.
Yeah.
But that took me into the rawest of grief, that when I emerged from, I suppose, the searing pain of it, I looked around and I was like, this is not,
Right. What
this
am I
isn't
doing
my
here?
world
Yeah.
anymore. It was literally like I just pressed a button and I'd been transported to a whole other place, another purpose. And I think that it's really powerful when we can see the
Yeah.
transformational side.
Well, and it doesn't mean that what you were doing before was wrong. I mean, I
Mhm.
also think about that with friendships. Like,
Yeah.
I think people who can't show up for you in your grief are still the great, wonderful people that you always loved.
Mm.
The change that's happened is you. They
Mhm.
signed up for the version of you before and they knew how to be friends with that person.
Yeah.
And so they have to grow and change as you are growing and changing too. And, you're barely up for the task. Maybe they're not up for the task, but that doesn't make them a villain.
Mhm.
It just means this is where our friendship sort of rests and we can be grateful. Like I said, I was angry all the time when I was grieving. I just can't imagine how that was for people because I'm not typically super reactive. I mean, I get pissy like everyone does, but I was really angry and I had no tolerance and I couldn't stay on phone calls and I couldn't stay at dinners and I couldn't stay in the room. It was like I had no table manners. And I can look at that and be like, God, that would have been a bummer. That I would have been a bummer to have at a dinner. And I can look at that and be like, and that was the best I could do. I mean, that I look at it with so much compassion for myself, and I'm like, oh God, I too wish that I could have been different in those moments, but I couldn't. I was doing the best I could. And so I do also think like it's important to say you can be angry and disappointed and hurt that people didn't show up and let them go with love without having to hate them, if that makes sense. Like you can leave relationships right where you can take all the information in and say, this is not a good person for me to be around anymore. This is not a good job for me to be doing. This is not a good marriage for me to be in. I need to move across the country and be near the water without saying, and I've always hated this house or I've always hated my boss, that you can do that. And again, I don't know that culture, people will say, why are you moving? Meaning, what bad thing happened? Culture has a lot of work to do to sort of be like, no, that happens. Like, imagine if everyone just knew that people feel the urge to move and to leave their jobs and often their marriages when they go through profound loss.
Mm.
Imagine if instead of being like, wow, Megan looks like she's really screwing it up right now because, she can't sit still and she's driving across the country with their kids, which is what I did after my mom died.
Mm.
Imagine if it was like, yeah, that's what people do. Because it is what people do. It is.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things, and I think I write about it, and can anyone tell me, I'm always trying to distinguish between the mental health issues that people have and grief as just a developmental process that needs to be supported in our lives. Grief is more like puberty. We don't send people to therapists because they're going through puberty, but we might if puberty really takes a toll on them. And the concept in sort of the mental health component of grief and loss around people wanting to move or leave or do things suddenly. We as therapists are often trying to titrate out the amount of change that somebody is going through. So if they're getting sober, let's say, we are like, well, I know you want to move to Arizona, but don't do it. Let's get sober. Let's start a community, no sudden movements. And I really did not understand how wrong that was for grievers. And I wished I could have called some people up and been like, man, I did not understand. When you were telling me you needed to move back home after your dad died, I didn't get it. And I get it now. What you were telling me was there was a jetpack of energy magnetizing you to moving back home, and that it wasn't rational, but it was true. And I didn't know that until I felt it myself, until I was like, I am a wild caged animal and I cannot sit on this porch. I cannot stand in this house. I cannot go back to life because life doesn't exist. Maybe I'll be able to live in this house again, but I can't right now. I need to do something totally and completely different because I am totally and completely different. And for my family, my mom died and then COVID happened 6 months later. Um, for my family, that different was driving across country during COVID. And we were in our minivan for 5 months, going to 28 states and 21 national parks and monuments, which is something I always wanted to be, an intrepid traveler who, just had a backpack. But it took my mom's death and all of the dysregulation for me to actually become that. And I'm not actually sure I could go, I'm not sure I could do it again. That was really related to the grief that I had in my system at the time. And people would say to me, they would text me and be like, you are such an amazing parent taking your kids on this amazing adventure during such a hard time. And I would text back, this is me grieving. This is about my grief.
Wow.
It was so painful for me to be sort of misunderstood. This was not about me trying to be a good parent. I mean, they could believe I was a good parent. I couldn't shift that, but I wasn't even doing it for my kids. I was doing it because I couldn't sit still. I felt like I didn't have a choice. If my husband had said, we can't go, I don't know if I would have had to go without them. I just know that sitting still and coming back to the house that I'm in now was not a choice. And I didn't really understand that. I had so many grievers who would be like, look, I have to leave this job. And I would say like, oh God, I really wish you wouldn't. They're like a community in there, but I get it now. And I want people to know that. And I want us to talk about it differently. It's one of those truisms of grief. Yeah.
I can really feel that openness for someone to just sit and listen.
Yeah.
And be there in those when
believe
there is
them.
that.
To believe what they say. And that's a big part of, can anyone tell me is the sort of prerequisite reading for a course that I teach, which is called the Grief Mentor Method, which is about how to create a personalized grief practice. And it has 6 core components to it. But the whole premise of it is, the truth for you. And the mechanism is a whole series of experimentations. You're not really sure what's going to feel supportive in your grief. We come up with an idea, maybe a hot yoga class. You come up with that. You think other people said it's good. Then we have you go try it. Go try a hot yoga class. You come back and you're like, that was the worst thing. Why do people do hot yoga? I wanted to die. Great. Hot yoga is not it. But then we find some kind of movement that you're like, oh no, this is good. I like this. I can feel the grief in my body, but I can feel it move through me while I'm in the class. Amazing. And then we just add that little tool to your basket of things that you can do to sort of help yourself grieve and become a griever. But the whole point of it is, we need to believe people when they tell you what's good for them and what's bad for them. And we need to gently encourage them to sort of stretch a little bit, like 2% more of something. If you don't want to get out of bed today at all, could you just get out of bed for like 10 minutes and walk around the porch of your house? Or just so that you can stretch, because you do need to do things to become. There is going to need to be shift and change that you have to participate in. But for a lot of grievers, that takes longer to get to than what our culture wants. We want them like up and moving around in 3 weeks.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's sort of funeral and then we move on. You should be done by now.
It's really nuts, because all of us who've been through profound loss are like, no, that's not how it goes. But I think because we are experiential learners, we don't really know until we know. And we have like images of TV and movies and things that don't really show the truth. I mean, there are a few shows out there that show the truth, but we look at grief like it's some kind of failure.
Yeah.
And we don't want to look like failures. We don't want to be failing. And it's not a failure. It's just a lap of life. We're walking around a track, and a couple of those laps feel real bad. Right? Mile 21 of the marathon. that feels real bad. It doesn't mean you ran a bad marathon. It just means like, yeah, that one hill sucked, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. And I think for me, that really resonates as well in the media that we consume, and then that pressure, and you go back to work and all of that things, and everyone's like, have you not, it's not spoken, but it's almost unspoken. And I think that is just the power of just being there to check in, just listen,
That's right.
just
That's
keep
right. And
thinking.
there's a lot that workplaces can do. We do, my consulting company has a curriculum that we bring into workplaces that really is designed so that when your employees experience a loss, the first thing they remember is that they took that class alongside all their colleagues about how to be a grief-informed workplace. And so that alone, right? Like if you have a workplace where they have free, water bottles, you just know that like it's okay to go in there really thirsty because there's plenty of water. If you go into a workplace where everyone has been trained in some of the core components of what's in Can Anyone Tell Me? Like this is what's normal. This is why you have to be flexible. This is what might be going on with their brain. This might be is going on with their body. This is how to ask, how to support them. This is what not to, ask. Those employees come back into a space very differently.
Mm,
It's a much more sort of collaboration and a co-creation of belief that they, as a whole human being who's been through something terrible, are invited back into the space rather than what a lot of employees describe, which is like, my boss sent a flower basket. They told me to take some time off. But then when I came back, I had 7,000 emails to respond to. And like nobody really asked me about, my dog dying or whatever it was.
wow.
So like,
Wow.
yeah, we care about you, but like what we really care about is that you get back to work.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You've got a brilliant TEDx talk all
I
about.
do talk about that. Thank you. Oh my gosh.
I will put the link in the show notes, as well as I love the one on grief, how grief needs to be in our education systems.
We're
I'll
working
put
on it.
both of those in the show notes because it's
Oh, you're
so
so kind.
important. And I think as well, what really resonates, I just want to give a shout out to your previous book, The End of the Hour, as well, your memoir, because that shows as well how you can have 15 years of experience in grief and loss, and it can still, and obviously, and equally, our whole experience, our whole life experience, childhood, everything can come up through that, just how complicated it is, which emphasizes just how important it is for that ongoing awareness. That I think, as a manager, if you can sense someone's not okay,
Yeah.
that's when you can be there to really support them.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of for those of us who have lived through hard events, we do all this dress rehearsal about how we think we're going to respond. In what I talk about in End of the Hours, my dad died 2 years before my mom died. And while that was a terribly sad experience, it wasn't traumatizing. Like it didn't knock me off my way. But when my mom died, I almost instantly was like sick, qualified as having the illness that sometimes happens to people when they're grieving. That was not a time for me to be like, I wonder why this has made me so unwell. I wonder the good luck, the real privilege that I had. You and I talked about this before we started recording, was that my experience made it so that I understood I was sick. I wasn't confused as to why I was quote unquote taking it so hard. I knew why. I knew why I was taking it so hard. And I knew that what was happening to me was unlikely to be something that I could manage by myself. So, unlike most of my clients who suffer with really profound symptoms, like diarrhea for a year, migraines for more than a year, I was really only suffering for about 2.5, 3 months before I ended up checking myself into an inpatient facility, which is not like one flew over the cuckoo's nest. An inpatient facility is like college, where every class is a therapeutic treatment. Every single thing you do, even eating breakfast and, doing PE, is designed to help you get back into your body in a way that feels safe. And that was the real privilege for me, was that I was like, "Oh, I am not okay. I'm just as not okay as the clients that I have treated, and I know exactly who to call and who can help." And I also had the good luck of, like, even though unfortunately those kinds of treatments, because 'cause they're so intensive, are so expensive, I knew that there were people who are wealthier than I am who cared about me that would help it make it affordable for me to seek out those treatments and get them. But that is not my way. When I wrote that book, it was not like, oh, follow me, right? Like when Elizabeth Gilbert wrote Eat, Pray, Love, she was pretty surprised to find all the people who were like, okay, I'm going to go to Bali and find her guru. I don't even name the facility in my book, although it's called On-Site in Tennessee. I'm really open about where I went. The program's called Milestones. I don't name it because it's not a place that most people are going to be able to go.
Mm.
And all the advocacy and education that I do is because I think all this should be available to every person. I think it's a social justice issue that it is not. I work with companies and corporations and charge them a bunch of money to do professional development training so that I can offer so much of this other stuff for free. Because my mission in life is I want people to be like, I want to be sitting on a bus one day and hear somebody say like, no, that's really common in grief. Don't you know? That's just a normal, typical grief symptom. It seems
Yes.
odd, but it's not. That's what I am looking for. And what keeps me alive are all the emails that people send me that are like, oh my God, you put this in your book. I thought it was just me. I'm going to tell other people. And that I'm like, let's do it. Let's figure out how to let everyone know. We do know. I mean, I know because I've been doing it for 22 years. Everybody sort of says the same things in, different ways about what is hard. And if we know it's hard, we should be able to figure out how to support people.
Oh, Megan, feels like this is a beautiful space for us to bring our conversation to a close with, if anyone wants more of you in their world, and there is, as you shared, you've got so much stuff that's out there that can really, really support people. How can people find out about you, get you in their orbit?
I don't know when this show is going to come out, but I have this totally exciting thing, which is that I'm about to teach Can Anyone Tell Me? I'm going to teach the book in 8 weeks. So we're going to there's 7 big headings, and I'm going to walk people through each one of the headings, and we're going to talk about it. And I'm going to invite people to talk about their symptoms and their experience and so that is starting on February 23rd. I think if you come over to my Instagram, I think there's not that many slots. We're going to try to keep the group small because it's really our pilot into it. I've taught it live a bunch, but this is the first time we'll be teaching it online. And I'm really excited. The curriculum is so great. I mean, it's really just based off the book, but I think it'll be for folks, there's so many people who can't go to therapy. There's so many people who their personality is not such to go to like a support group. I'm really hoping those folks will come in, talk to a smaller group of people, ask their questions, get their questions answered, feel, what's normal. Anyway, so they can come do that, come take the class. If you're in the States, I'm going to be teaching at Omega with Barry Liner Grant from the Memory Group in May and Memorial Day weekend at Omega Institute, which is so exciting. And then in July, I'm going to be at the Cape Cod Institute for a week, which I'm really excited about with all these luminaries like Bessel van der Kolk and Dick Schwartz and Deb Dana. Yeah, it's going to be amazing. So if you come to my Instagram, you can go to my website and get on the newsletter. We will tell you when all the things are happening. We're really good about sending out like, hey, Megan's going to be here. And, and I'm always adding things to the calendar. So, just come over, find us, send us a DM, and we'll get you all connected.
Oh, I love that. I'll put all the links in the show note. I'll also put about your book, Can Anyone Tell Me, is for me an absolutely essential guide to grief. I would say if you're grieving or if you know someone who's grieving, it's just incredible. It's all the questions that I wish I had answered at my
so grateful that it helped. You never know. There are a million grief books out there, and you just never know if it's going to be helpful. But it means even if you and I are the only two who are like, well, this book was good. That is enough for me because it's been so meaningful to you, and I'm just really grateful for that.
I love that. I think for me, it's the things that you don't even think about. That reading it, I thought, oh yeah, okay, that's common in grief. So I'd definitely recommend that. And for any memoir lovers, The End of the Hour is brilliant. I literally started reading it last Friday, and I finished it on Monday. I just blazed through it. absolutely loved it. And I think as well, that openness where we share these stories, we can start to tune into the truth of what grief is, and then create through our own ripple effect a better world through our conversation. So Megan, I am so, so grateful to you for joining me today on Death on the Daily, and just for everything that you do.
Thank you so much. I'm honored. This was such a lovely conversation. You're such a joy.
All of my gratitude to you for joining me for another Dead Conversation. Death on the Daily is edited by David Strutt. The music is Set Free by Katie Gray. And I am Tanya Wilkinson. And if you enjoyed this episode, I would be over the moon if you can rate, review, and subscribe. It really, really helps me to get the word out there. And if you want to say hi or to hear more about my work as a coach and death doula, including how I support my clients to navigate their death on the daily, then all of the ways that you can connect with me are in the show notes. I'll be back soon with some more Dead Conversations. And in the meantime, take good care of yourself and others.
There's a cold fire, there's a crossfire, and there's something inside. And we'll never, never make it, and we'll never, never break.